Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Alaskan Adaptations Wildlife and the Will to Survive, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Laura Geissinger. Thank you so much for being here today, Laura. Over to you.
Thanks, Brooke. Again, my name is Laura, and I'm an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures, and my background is in biology and environmental science. And today I'm really excited to talk to you about the subarctic here in Alaska and the plants and animals that live here and how they are able to survive. When people think of Alaska, they often think about it as a very harsh and cold place, which is true. It's not always the case that it's harsh and cold here, but even in the summers, it is a challenging place for many plants and animals to survive. And that is evidenced by the relatively few species that actually live here compared to the number that are able to exist in the tropics. And today I'm going to specifically talk about a few plants and animals and their adaptations. While there are many more adaptations we won't get to, we could do an entire college course on it. We're just going to briefly cover a few examples today. And there are physiological, anatomical, and behavioral mechanisms that allow the plants and animals to survive in such a harsh environment. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So to understand what the subarctic is, we first need to talk about what the Arctic is. And the Arctic is the northernmost region of the Earth near the North Pole. And it is it has very distinct polar conditions and is generally considered the area within the Arctic Circle, which is the area above 66 degrees north latitude. And within this region, there is at least one annual period of 24 hours where the sun does not set and one in which the sun does not rise. But for some regions, there's many more days than one that's either dark all day or light all day. But it's that line where it's at least one or more days like that a year is what is considered Arctic. And another way that people sometimes refer to the Arctic is a place where trees can't grow. And sometimes it's also described as being a place where the average summer temperature does not get above 50 degrees. Even if you have some days that get above that, on average, your summer temperature is 50 degrees. So now that we understand what the Arctic is, let's talk about what the subarctic is. And the subarctic is the region just south of the Arctic, and it encompasses most of Alaska. And so this is an area where trees can grow, although when you start getting up on alpine slopes, that impacts your trees as well. But in this, so the trees are able to grow in the subarctic, and again, it encompasses most of Alaska. So what are things that characterize the subarctic? It's characterized by having really long and hard winters. And we can get really cold temperatures, even down to like negative 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Persistent winds, we get a lot of windstorms. And even if it's not a big windstorm, there's often just a low-grade wind that is always present. And we have snow, and the snow can be on the ground for 6 months or more throughout the year. And then for the summers, they're characterized by being short and cool to mild. However, during the summer, it can get hot with occasional days getting up even into the 90s. The highest recorded temperature was 100 degrees. And so those dramatic seasonal swings produce significant seasonality in food quality and availability. So much of the subarctic has permafrost underneath it. And permafrost is what we call permanently frozen ground. And the further south you go in Alaska and in the subarctic in general, the more patchy the permafrost is going to be. We call it discontinuous permafrost. The thicker the active layer becomes, so that's where your um, soil is, and that's what your plants are going to be growing in, is that active layer. And then you can see on this diagram that as you go further south, the permafrost also becomes shallower. And so you don't have near as deep of frozen ground as you do in the Arctic and the far northern part of the subarctic. So in the permafrost is also impacting what can grow and live in these regions. So this is a species diversity richness map, and I just want to show you this so you can see how there's generally a much higher species richness towards the equator than there is towards the poles. So if you look at the map and look up to where Alaska is, you can see that there is just really low species diversity in the Arctic and subarctic. All right, so now we have talked about what the subarctic is. So let's talk about what an adaptation is. And an adaptation is a process by which a species becomes fit to survive its environment. And so it's able to adjust to specific circumstances. When I'm referring to an adaptation, it's not saying that an animal is employing a thought process to calculate or plan consciously for their future. Instead, it's just instead these adaptations come about because, like, through natural selection as they evolve over time to survive in these situations. And this presentation will be mostly addressing the physical and behavioral adaptations that plants and animals have to survive in the subarctic. So based on what we now know about the subarctic, we can begin to understand why plants and animals need specific adaptations to survive these harsh and extreme conditions. So winter life can be really hard. There is reduced access to food. There's lower ambient temperatures, which increases metabolic rates. There's less available energy, and the reproduction of these animals can be affected by the winters. But the summers aren't necessarily easy either. They come with their own set of challenges, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. So, what can animals do to survive the winter? Well, they can survive it, or they can avoid it by migrating or dying. They can become inactive by going into a state of torpor or hibernation, or they can remain active either above the snow or below the snow. So one of the adaptive strategies that we're going to talk about to beat the cold, short days of winter and the lack of food is to migrate. And what migration is, it's a directed movement of individuals that's repeated by those individuals or their offspring each year. When I refer to migration, it's not just a random wandering. And it's very repeatable, very predictable from generation to generation. And not all migration means leaving the subarctic. Sometimes animals migrate locally, and we'll talk about one of those in a little bit. So there's several advantages to migration, and one of those advantages is an energetic advantage. Another one is a feeding advantage, and another is a reproductive advantage. So there's more food in the summertime, so they can come here for the summer, but there's very little food in the winter. So if they leave, that can help them. And as far as the energy, there's so much sunlight in the summer that helps produce more food. So that's helping animals gain more energy. And then for the reproductive advantage, predators like to come to places, or prey like to come to places like the subarctic, where there's actually very few predators compared to elsewhere. And so it's a good, easy place for them to come. But there's also some downfalls to migrating, because if there's a lot of energetic cost involved in migration, and individuals in poor condition might not survive the journey. And if they do survive, they might be in such a poor condition that they can't resist the predators. So we're going to talk about a couple different animals that migrate. The Arctic tern is one of those. It holds the record for being the longest migrator in the world. And it spends its summers in the northern hemisphere in tundra ponds. And then in their migrations, they go offshore in the spring and fall, or the spring, yeah, and fall for their migrations. And annually, they're flying about 25,000 miles. And they are the birds that are exposed to more daylight than any other animal species, because they're spending their summers up in the Arctic and subarctic and their winters down in the Antarctic. So here you can just see a map of their migration routes, and you can see how far they truly are flying to avoid the subarctic winters. So another bird that is a really amazing migrator here in Alaska, and one that is very common, especially in the Fairbanks area, is the sandhill crane. And for birds, there's several different triggers that are going to tell them like it's time to leave, but a lot of their preparation for migration is driven by hormonal levels. And the hormones are regulated by the length of the days. And so as the day lengths change, that triggers in the birds, okay, it's time to eat more. They go into hyperphagia. They are just getting really fat. And some of these birds, like the sandhill crane, can gain about 10% of its body weight per day towards the end of the season, right before it leaves for the winter. And like for the sandhill cranes, the adults are putting on their weight much faster than the young are. And these birds, they migrate in flocks of hundreds to thousands. And they are quite impressive, where they can cover between 300 and 500 miles a day. And then they'll gather at night, generally on lakes and ponds or near water sources, with thousands of other birds. And then they will spend their winters in places like Texas or South Dakota and Nebraska. So here you can see where their migration path is as well. And while we generally think of the subarctic being just land-based, there are also other animals in the marine ecosystems that follow some of these same migration patterns for the same reasons. So for example, humpback whales spend their winters in Hawaii and Mexico, and then they come to Alaska to feed on the abundance of plankton that we have in the summer. All right, so another way to survive the winter is by becoming inactive. And some animals go into what we call torpor, which we kind of generally lump torpor and true hibernation together, but they are a little bit different. So I'm just going to briefly address that. And so torpor is a short period of dormancy. The body temperature and metabolic rates do decrease to conserve energy, but they don't decrease as much as they do in deep hibernation. And so, for example, with bears, we think of bears as being hibernators, but they're actually going into a state of torpor. And so their body temperatures, their heart rates, it's not slowing to the same level it is when we're going to go into like some of the animals that are deep hibernators. And so we'll talk about a few adaptations that bears have. They're omnivorous and are going to be eating plants and animals. And so they can eat a lot of different types of food. which allows them to put on a lot of weight. If they were really picky eaters and just had a few food sources, going into torpor would be much harder for them. They might be in their dens for over 200 days in some parts of Alaska, and so they really need to focus on that foraging. Um, and bears can technically come out of their dens during the winter, especially if energy resources are depleted. But it is not common, and generally, if bears are coming out of their dens in the winter, they're going to be searching for food and be dangerous bears. Another adaptation that bears have is that they have delayed implantation. And so they will mate in June and July, but that embryo doesn't really implant into the wall of the uterus until the fall after they have put on their weight to see if they have enough fat on their body to sustain themselves and cubs until springtime in their den. Because the cubs are born in the middle of the winter, and when they are born, they're very small and they can just fit in the palm of your hand. But then they'll nurse on their mothers during the rest of the season until they come out in the spring. And that's what we think of as bear cubs. And the amount of weight they are able to put on in the summer to survive being in their dens would be unhealthy to humans. Like, we couldn't gouge ourselves in the same way. So they have special physiological adaptations to survive that. All right, so while some animals go through periods of torpor, others go through really extreme and exaggerated prolonged periods of hibernation. And in hibernation, the body temperature is really reduced and the heart rate is really reduced as well, as is the metabolic rate. And breathing is very slow, and hibernation is an adaptation to the far north, but it can also really be a constraint because the hibernator is really busy during its active season. And during that time, it can expend a lot of energy defending its territory, reproducing, putting on fat, and perhaps digging a new den for itself. So it's expending a lot of energy in a very short amount of time, while it's also trying to put on weight so it can survive the winter in hibernation. And for most hibernators, their active period is going to be between 3 and 5 months long, and the rest of the year they're going to be in their dens. So one of our hibernators is the Arctic bumblebee, and these guys hibernate for about 9 months in underground burrows. These will be some of the earliest insects to come out in the springtime. On a sunny day, you can see them sitting exposed in the sun for a while in order to warm up. They sometimes are very sluggish until they start heating up then. And after, like, the queen bee is able to visit flowers and get nectar and pollen, then she'll start building a nest to lay her eggs in. If she is out and about looking for the early flowers and is getting too cold, she'll actually start shivering to bring up her body temperature, because as you can see from this picture, she has a really thick coat of hair that can help trap and conserve heat. The Arctic ground squirrel is also a true hibernator, and they spend between 5.5 and 6.5 months in hibernation here in Alaska. In the fall, the squirrels start going into nightly torpor. So these are just short periods where their body temperatures, their heart rates, everything slows down overnight. And then over time, that period of torpor gets longer until they go into their deep hibernation. So initially, when they're in their state of torpor, their body temperatures during the day are going to be about 99 degrees or so. And then at night, it's going to drop down to about 91 to 93 degrees. But then as their periods of torpor get longer, their nightly body temperature is going to drop down to about 77 degrees. And in the dead of winter, they have been found to have body temperatures as low as 27 degrees and are still able to survive that. So once they start going into those periods of torpor every night and it gets longer, then they're just going to stay in their burrow for the rest of the winter. And every few weeks, their bodies will slightly wake up enough that they can shiver to warm their body temperatures back up to a place that they can survive. And then all of their systems will slow down again. And then in springtime, their periods of torpor will start getting shorter again. So they'll come out of that deep hibernation and start having little periods of activity. And then as the spring wears on into summer, those periods of activity get longer until they are out of their burrows for the summer and running around. And the ground squirrels actually will cache food to eat in the spring when they come out before food is available for them. So you will see them storing up food, but it's not for them to eat in the winter. It's for them to eat in the spring when they come out, especially if they emerge while there's still snow on the ground. Another true hibernator is the wood frog, and the wood frog is the only amphibian in interior Alaska, and they are freeze tolerant, which I find to be absolutely amazing. In the fall, the wood frogs dig down and burrow in the duff, like in wetlands and around the edges of lakes and ponds, and they will stay there all winter long. And in the summer, each frog is storing up its energy reserves in the liver as glycogen. And then as their tissues begin to freeze come winter, the liver glycogen is converted to glucose and then is released into the blood. So the extent of freezing protection depends on the amount of glucose that they've released into the circulation. And the glucose helps to trap water in the cells, keeping the proteins in solution, and interferes with ice crystal formation. And it's also serving as an energy releasing substrate to help keep the metabolic demands of the frog's tissues when the circulation is not happening in the winter. So another way that animals can deal with the winter is to remain active above ground. And mammals generate heat in proportion to their volume, but lose heat in proportion to their surface areas. So small mammals and birds lose heat faster than larger mammals and birds do because of their surface area to volume ratio, and must generate heat faster to maintain a constant temperature. Some animals are going to huddle or clump together to reduce heat loss. Some choose microhabitats to reduce that heat loss. An example of choosing a microhabitat is going to be like the red squirrel, that in the summer, you'll see them in the tops of the trees a lot, but in the winter, they will remain on the ground for the most part and in middens close to the ground where it's much warmer than it is at the top of the trees. And some animals are going to shiver to produce heat as well. So we are going to talk about wolves. They have what is called counter-current heat exchange. And you might look at some animals and wonder why their feet and tails don't freeze. And the reason they don't freeze is because of the structure and functioning of their circulatory system in their extremities. And in their extremities, their arterial blood vessels are right next to their veins. And so the hot arterial blood is losing heat as it leaves from the heart, and it is running right next to the cold venous blood that's returning from the extremities so that heat exchange can happen between those. And so the heat is conserved by the blood flow running in opposite directions, but right close together there. And there's some heat loss in that process. And so your extremities will be cooler, but it allows them to not freeze. Caribou have many adaptations. We're not going to discuss all of them, but they have some really cool adaptations to survive in the subarctic. Caribou are local migrators. So what that means is they are remaining in the subarctic year round, but in the winter they're going to move to lower elevations where it's easier for them to acquire food under the snow. And some of them will even go into forested habitats where there maybe is a little bit less snow and finding food's even a little bit easier. And then in the spring, the pregnant females are going to move higher up onto the ridges where there is wind, and the wind helps keep, and they'll have their calves up there, and the wind helps keep the insects from bothering their calves. And the higher ridges also allow them some visibility to see predators coming. Caribou are able to go into a reproductive pause if they're not in good shape. So like if they've had poor nutritional status. And the females can remain barren for a year until they become healthy enough and their body weight increases to the point where they can reproduce again. So caribou are also really bothered by some insects, but these are the insects living on the caribou is one of their adaptations to survive in the subarctic, but they are quite a nuisance to the caribou. One of those is the warble fly, and the warble flies lay 500 to 700 eggs on the leg or back of the caribou, and then the larvae hatch out and burrow under the skin and keep moving up towards the back of the caribou, and they'll like make little breathing holes, and then they'll live there and form a cyst on the skin, and they're going to live in there for about a year, uh, like feeding on connective tissue of the caribou. And then in about a year, they're going to burrow their way through and drop off onto the ground. Another parasite that is really bothersome to the caribou is the botfly. And a female botfly lays its eggs about in the nostril of the caribou, and they will crawl up into the nasal cavity and stay there. And eventually the caribou is going to sneeze out the maggots, which allows them to pupate on the ground and reach their adult form then. So the caribou have to survive the subarctic, but in all these parasites, but then also the insects, the botfly, the warblefly, they are using the caribou in their survival strategies. So caribou also use countercurrent heat exchange like wolves do. And I just want to show you this picture here because this was done on a caribou that was in negative 24 degree Fahrenheit temperatures standing in the snow. Their core body temperature was 100.4 degrees. And then it had, like you can see here on its head and its nostril, it had a 97 degree, 93, 75, down to its nose where it was 68 degrees. And then on its feet, you can see where the temperatures dropped down there as well, to 48 and 54 degrees. And so you can see the main part of the body where the organs are stays nice and toasty warm, even when it's really cold outside. but those extremities don't need to be kept as warm, but they're still remaining above freezing and allows for their survival. Caribou also have special adaptations on their hooves, and their hooves are really large and concave and hollow. And they kind of act like a snowshoe, if you will, as they spread out as the caribou walks on snow or tundra, and that helps to support and distribute their weight across each step. And their hooves also allow them to grip on ice. In the summer, those hooves are going to act as paddles when they swim. And when they're walking, to help make walking easier, when they lift up one foot, their hind foot comes directly in that same hole. And so they're not having to make as many holes in the ground, which is helping ease their walking through snow. And you may have even heard yourselves that caribou, when they walk, there's a clicking sound, or you may just have heard it anecdotally, and they do really click when they walk. And that's because there's a tendon in their foot that snaps over the bone when they walk. And that is an adaptation that helps them stay in contact with other members in their herd, especially during snowstorms. And so out in the winter, if they can't see each other in a whiteout blizzard, they can still hear each other using that clicking of their hooves. So another member of the deer family, moose have their calves as early as they can in the spring to coordinate with food sources reappearing. So they want their young calves to have as much time eating fresh vegetation as they can. And moose can eat up to 44 pounds of food a day. And during the summer, they're feeding on a lot of twigs and grasses and like things like fireweed and aquatic vegetation. But in the winter, they're mostly eating willow twigs and things like dwarf birch, aspen, poplar. And mammals can't synthesize an enzyme that digests cellulose, but moose are rumens, and they have rumen that can digest that cellulose, allowing them to eat wood in the winter. So they're just like eating these twigs in the winter. And that the plant material that the moose is eating is very low in proteins, but the microorganisms in their stomach are high in protein. And so they recycle the urea, which is nitrogen containing, and it reabsorbs from the bladder and sends it back through the circulatory system. And then when it reaches the wall of the rumen, then it's secreted back into the moose's body. So the bacteria then breaks it down and converts it into amino acids so they can build their own proteins. Which is really amazing that these very, very large animals are subsisting on twigs in the winter. And moose also use mineral licks, especially early spring, because their sodium levels have become depleted over the winter. And so they're trying to replenish their sodium levels. And their spring foliage is rich in potassium. And so they need to balance their sodium potassium intake. And so that's also why they really like using these salt licks, mineral licks in the springtime. Another adaptation that moose have is their fur. They have hollow guard hairs that trap air to insulate the moose, and kind of like a puffy jacket, like a lightweight down jacket or something like that. And then they also have a really soft undercoat that helps trap air and helps insulate them as well. So to me, one of the most amazing birds is the black-capped chickadee. And so they have multiple adaptations, and in a minute I'll get to my favorite one. But the black-capped chickadees have a behavioral adaptation where they fluff their feathers to increase the thickness and of their insulative layer, reducing their heat loss. They go into a state of nightly torpor, and so their body temperatures lower a little bit every night. And that way they have to use less metabolic energy to stay warm when their body temperatures are decreasing at night like that. And that also helps them slow the rate at which they shiver. In Alaska, these chickadees can use this year round. So sometimes we get really cool nights in the summer. And so chickadees can do this year round. But scientists have found out that chickadees in other parts of the lower 48 are not able to do this in the summer. Even if the ambient temperatures drop low, they're just not able to do that, which I think is really interesting. But one of the things that I think is most amazing about the chickadee is that their hippocampus, or their memory center of their brain, is going to grow throughout the summer by up to 30%, so they can store up food for the winter. And then throughout the winter, as they eat their food supplies, their hippocampus starts to decrease again, so they're not having to continue to exert all that energy supporting such a large hippocampus. All right, now we're going to talk about animals that remain active below the snow. One of these animals is the pika, and pika live on talus slopes and boulder fields and spend a lot of their time in late summer gathering food that they're going to need for the winter. So when they're grazing, they're generally eating grasses, but when they are storing up their food for winter, they're mostly focusing on forbs, such as dwarf fireweed, horsetails, lowbush cranberries, crowberries, willow, ferns, things like that. And so that's what they're going to be eating in the winter instead of the grasses like they're eating in the summer. And part of what they're storing up is going to depend on what is available in that area and what's nutritious for them. So they make what the scientists call hay piles, and those have been found measuring as large as 19 inches high and 22 inches wide. And in areas where there's a lot of wind, the pika might store their food piles underneath the rocks. They don't hibernate like some of the other animals do. They remain active all winter long, and they'll come out and sun themselves on the rocks, and they'll eat the food that they've stored in their hay piles. All right, so now I've mostly been talking about the winter, but now we're going to talk about and winter and animals, and now we're going to talk about plants and talk a little bit more about summer adaptations of some of the plants. So many herbaceous plants have adaptations to survive the climates that they live in. And it's really interesting with subarctic plants is that they generally have some similar adaptations to plants that are found in the desert as well. Here we find that a lot of our plants are squat and low to the ground. Our cushion plants, they kind of grow in mats along the ground. And there's very, very few annual plants that live in the subarctic. And most of the plants here are going to be perennials. And a lot of our plants emphasize self-fertility because insect pollinators aren't as diverse as they are, say, towards the equator. And the survival of their reproductive maturity of the environmental extremes for a species depends on either good luck or a combination of traits that work well at those extremes. So if they can rely on themselves instead of insects, then it helps ensure that their genetic material is going to be passed on. So self-fertilizing plants produce offspring that are similar genetically to themselves. And so generally those plants are going to be able to survive the conditions that they've been in, but that also can be a hard thing because if your genes are the same, and there's something that wipes out a population, because of, like say a disease comes in that targets a specific plant, when it's all the same genetic material, it is likely that that plant will then get wiped out. There's also in the subarctic a lot of seed banks where plants will produce seeds and they will just remain in the ground for years and years on end until the conditions are right and those seeds can then germinate. So during the winter, the winds that come across the subarctic can carry snow and ice particles with them. And so when you're really close down to the surface of the ground, the wind is not very bad, but you go up a few inches and the wind just whips. And then once you get above that layer, the wind isn't as bad again. And so we call it snow or ice shear, where the wind is taking those snow and ice particles and just shaving any of the vegetation that sticks up above the snow level, and is just taking like a razor blade across them, cutting them off. And you can see these spruce trees were able to emerge up past that level where that is happening, where the scouring's happening. But it takes them quite a few years to go through that. And it is also very hard, like energetically on them, because they're missing part of their needles from that area for their photosynthesis. And then in the summer, the winds are really persistent and dry out the plants. So another thing that you'll see on our plants here is a flag tree or a Krumholtz tree, where you have prevailing winds just coming from one direction really regularly, and that makes the branches basically just grow on one side of the tree. And again, you can see like lower down towards the ground, it's able to grow on all sides of the tree, but then as it grows up, it needs to adapt. And so like if you would do a cross section of the tree, you could see how the tree is now growing more on one side than on the other. So this is a pasque flower, and it is one of the earliest blooming plants in the spring. And generally these flowers are found on south-facing slopes to get that energetic advantage of having warmth earlier on. And so by early to mid-May, you're going to see these flowers blooming. And the sepals have hair on their backsides. And when they first start to bloom, the stems are really short and low to the ground, and they don't have any basal leaves initially. So once they start flowering and the flower fully emerges, the leaves will start growing, and the flower starts to elongate and droop down. And these flowers use seed dispersal to propagate. So these are louseworts, and louseworts have a very dense woolly coat for insulation. And they also have a unique root system that allows them to access nutrients in frozen soil. They grow really low to the ground to resist the wind. And there's also a thought that the shape of the flower helps to protect them from the cold. There's still research being done on that, but that is one thought that scientists have. So this here is an early picture of a woolly lousewort before the flowers bloom, just so you can see how dense that hair is. And that dense hair helps to trap the heat on some subarctic plants. There's quite a few who have hair on them, but the woolly lousewort is an extreme example of that. And each hair absorbs some of the sunlight energy that strikes it and then reflects a portion of that energy, and often is then reflected, the reflected light strikes another hair or another part of the same plant, continuing that warming effect. So this is a low bush cranberry, and it has evergreen leaves. And evergreen leaves can photosynthesize when winter temperatures and light intensities are adequate. So they're not necessarily able to photosynthesize all parts of the winter, but for periods of the day or periods of some days, they are able to still continue to photosynthesize, where many plants cannot do that. And with these, the leaves are going to last a year or two and then die off, but the plant itself can last much longer. And low bush cranberries, along with many other types of plants, form these really thick mats for insulation. So you have a bunch of leaves clustered together, warming each other up. Here we have arnica, um, the Arctic arnica, frigid arnica. It has several different common names, but these, along with many other types of plants in the subarctic, are heliotropic, and they track the sun, so sun-loving. And so as the day progresses, the flower turns so that it's always facing the sun, concentrating the solar energy and warming the flower parts. And it's also been proposed that insect activity might be higher on heliotropic plants and increase the pollination period because of the warmth of those plants. So cushion plants like this alpine azalea have a thermal advantage over taller plants. So the temperatures near the ground are usually warmer than even just 6 or 7, 8 inches above the ground surface. And so a lot of these species that grow in cushion form like this have a dense cluster of leaves at the base that's going to help trap that warm air for them. And so you'll have like these little islands of plants, and those little islands of plants can also help break the wind, and it allows them to collect dust and debris from the air to help increase their little island cluster size. And they also, a lot of the plants here, as is true with the alpine azalea, have darker stems and leaves that help to absorb heat faster than lighter colored leaves. So this here is the Canadian dogwood or dwarf dogwood, and they use asexual reproduction by rhizomes. And again, this is advanced to shoot off and continue growing. But the problem with that again is that genetically it's identical to the parents, and so when there are like disease outbreaks or things like that, it can hit some types of plants harder when it's all just the same genetic material. There's other types of asexual reproduction that subarctic plants use, things like tubers, and a lot of times they'll just use these asexual reproduction instead of seed reproduction to make their success more likely. And sometimes plants will use multiple types of reproduction. So again, talking about plant reproduction, this is fireweed. And a fireweed shoot can emanate from an existing rhizome of the healthy mature fireweed. And so again, it's just making for a fast, easy spreading, like with the Canadian dogwood. And these plants can just grow into like huge areas. So here we have mountain avens, and you can see that there are some dead and withered leaves like at the base of them that have not dropped off. And these help shelter and insulate the rest of the plant. And they are thick to reduce moisture loss. Their leaves are thick to reduce moisture loss. They have little hairs helping to moisture. They can have wrinkles that help retain moisture. They follow the sun. They have wind seed dispersal, long tap roots. So they have quite a few different adaptations. So the last one we're going to talk about is the bell heather. They are drought tolerant and they have wide roots to absorb moisture. They have narrow needle-like leaves to reduce water loss. And they can survive fires and the surviving stem from that fire can produce new sprouts of plants. Oh, there was one more. I thought that was my last one. But these are Arctic willow, and they use branch layering for reproduction, which means the branch bends towards the ground and covers with soil, and then a root will form and bend, and a new plant can grow from there. So that's some about subarctic adaptations, but the climate here is changing. Our summers and winters are both getting hotter. And in some areas, we're getting more snowfall. In other areas, we're getting less snowfall. The tree line is changing, and tundra ponds are shrinking. So, and there's other impacts of climate change on the subarctic, but for today, we're just gonna look at these ones. So what does that mean for our plants and animals? It means there's a loss of waterways for migration, making food even harder as the birds are migrating. We're losing some of our insects, and so there's not as an abundance of food in the summer. There's an increase in different types of parasites and disease that before couldn't withstand the winters, but may potentially start withstanding the winters. There's shifts in some of our ecosystems. There's changing food sources, and there's disruptions to hibernation. So all of these things are issues that our plants and animals up here are facing. And to survive those changes, they're either going to need to continue to evolve and adapt, or some of them may die off, or they may need to move to new areas to be able to survive. So for today, that is all I have. This is a topic, like I said, we could talk about and have an entire college course on it. But thank you so much for your time today.
Well, Laura, thank you. That was so good. I know I learned a tremendous amount, and I'm sure that everybody who tuned in did as well. You went through so many species, and thank you for also including plants. Sometimes those are left out of the conversation, so thank you for including those. All right, everyone, we do have a little bit of time for questions here. So there is a question function in your go-to control panel. So go ahead and put them in there, and we'll get through as many as we can before we'll wrap up for the day. So let's look through here. If we could go back to ground squirrels, how do they manage their body not freezing if they let their body temperature itself get so low?
They go through periods where they're not awake, but their bodies will warm up and shiver enough to like warm their bodies back up. So they'll drop really low, like say down to 27 degrees. But then when it hits that critical temperature, their bodies just start shivering and warming them back up. And then the temperatures will drop again. But if when they only go through short periods of shivering every now and then, it helps them conserve energy instead of just trying to shiver all the time to maintain a higher temperature.
Great, thank you. Someone mentioned some of the photos looked like there was really strong wind. Is that a big factor that is also prominent in the subarctic? And if so, how do these plants deal with that?
Yeah, the wind is a huge issue. And so if you think back to the pictures I showed you of the spruce trees, the wind can be really bad in the summer and the winter and can scour plants. And so how many of the subarctic plants deal with this is that they stay really low to the ground and remain under the snow level in the winter and then stick really close to the ground in the summer so that they are able to stay warm. And also, some plants want to be a little bit higher up because they use wind dispersal for their seeds, but most plants are not using wind dispersal here. And so they want to be really low to the ground. And they'll also be in clusters, like a couple of those cushion plant ones I showed you, like the alpine azalea, the low bush cranberry. Those plants will cluster together to help resist the impacts of the wind.
Great, thank you. Next, staying on the plant conversation, how do they manage permafrost? Do their roots go all the way down, or how does that work, the relationship between plants and permafrost in the
So I'm
area?
going to quickly scroll back through my pictures to go back to the one about the permafrost. Sorry, I don't have a good way to get back to it without scrolling. Um, so with the permafrost, in much of the subarctic, in much of the subarctic, we don't have continuous permafrost. It's patchy. So if you look at this area, like from Fairbanks south, you can see that there's patches of permafrost, and you can also see that that active layer is getting thicker. And so in much of the subarctic, there is like this active layer of soil that is relatively thick where the plants can grow so their roots aren't having to get down into that permafrost. Although there are areas that are really patchy, and it is very hard for the plants, like with permafrost close to the surface, that's hard for the plants to grow in that. And so sometimes you'll see like these gnarly roots just kind of like spreading out on the surface of the ground, trying to find a place where they can kind of dig in and get a grip. But in a lot of the subarctic, you have a fairly thick active layer, so the plants aren't having to dig their roots into the permafrost.
Perfect, thank you. Very informative. That was very helpful. Next, going back to how climate change has impacted subarctic species, could you elaborate a little further on that? Are there any particular species that come to mind that are being particularly impacted, and what is being done to help with that?
So, one animal that I can think of, I was just asked about it yesterday, which is why it's still top on my mind, is moose. And in some areas like New Hampshire, there is a tick that has really been decimating moose populations. And here in Alaska, that has not reached us yet. But there is definite concern that at some point that same type of tick will reach here with warming climates. And so like there's not like so their biologists are tracking the moose and the health of the moose and trying to like keep an eye on what's happening, but it is really hard when some of these changes are happening globally to like stop them without like stopping climate change altogether, right? So that's one that comes specifically to mind. Some of our migratory bird species are having a harder time with some of our ponds disappearing, finding places to stop on their migration paths. And so that is becoming a thing where we are seeing less egg production, but from some different species of birds. So what's being done, a lot of what's being done is biologists are really just trying to understand what is going on with these species, so we can try to come up with ways that we can help them. And I don't know if that means at some point we'll put in fake ponds or things like that. But as of yet, we have not gone that route.
Well, great. Well, thank you for all of this wonderful information. That is the last question we will take for today, as we are so close to the top of the hour. So, Laura, I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
I just want to say thank you all for joining me. It's been a really fun morning. Have a great day.
Yes, and thank you, Laura, for taking all that time to put together this amazing presentation and teach us about these very important and just unique species. So, I would like to also thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nethab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.